They flew so low you could see the silver shine on their wings. You could almost hear the confidence of the pilots inside those American Mustangs, slicing the air above a capital that had no more fight left in it. Not a single shot was fired. No resistance, no warning sirens, just the mechanical growl of enemy aircraft parading freely over Tokyo. For the first time in her life, Keiko realized what true defeat sounded like. And it sounded like silence beneath roaring engines. The city below didn't burn that morning. It didn't scream. It simply watched, breath held, bones stiff, spirit cracked. Buildings still stood, but they looked like empty shells. People moved like shadows. Children pointed up at the sky, with fingers trembling not from awe, but from a question that had no answer. Why did no one stop them? Keiko stood on the narrow balcony of her apartment in Shibuya, the same building where she once listened to classical concerts from a neighbor's phonograph. Now, only the the distant hum of foreign engines filled the air, steady and cruel. In her hands, a relic from a life she tried to erase. A military-issued radio receiver, scratched and discolored, the same one she had used during long nights of translation for imperial officers. It still worked. It still spoke. That morning, it coughed up a final message in broken code, half static, half desperation. Then, silence. She had been an interpreter during the war, fluent in English, trained to translate orders, confessions, and sometimes pleas. Her voice had been used to communicate life and death decisions. She never pulled a trigger, but her words sealed fates. And today, as the Mustangs drew arcs across her sky, she felt every syllable echo back like a judgment she could no longer dodge. On the corner of the avenue, an old man dropped to his knees and bowed to the passing planes. Others pretended not to see. A group of women covered their faces, not out of shame, but as if hiding would make them invisible to history. That was what it felt like, as if history was finally here, and it was looking straight into their souls. Keiko remembered her father's voice during the early months of the war. A school teacher turned loyalist. He spoke of honor, sacrifice, and the emperor as if they were sacred truths. He used to say, "Tokyo will never fall." But Tokyo did not fall. It evaporated, not in flames, not in rubble, but in dignity. When enemy aircraft fly over your home and no one flinches, it means the fight is already over. You just didn't notice when it ended. She thought of her younger self, sitting in a cold interrogation room, head set tight against her ears, her voice calm as she translated a prisoner's sobs. She was only 20, but already she had stopped asking herself if what she did was right. Her job was to make English sound like obedience. Sometimes she would adjust a word, soften a command, delay a message. Small rebellions no one noticed, but they didn't save anyone. And now, none of it mattered. The Mustangs made another loop. Keiko didn't blink. She wanted to see them. She needed to see them. They weren't just planes. They were reminders of the choices she made, the people she betrayed, the people she couldn't save, of a sister who vanished without a trace after the night she whispered one final sentence through Keiko's door. They know. For years, Keiko tried to live quietly, anonymously. After the surrender, she had traded uniforms for silence. She worked at a bookstore, wore gray clothes, avoided neighbors, but the war never really ended inside her. It lingered in the corners of her apartment, in the shadows behind her eyes, in the voice of the radio that she never had the courage to throw away. The Americans were not bombing today. They didn't need to. They had already won. This was not a show of force. It was a show of ownership. And deep inside, Keiko felt a cruel clarity blooming. They were here because no one could stop them. Because everything they feared from Japan was already gone. And yet, in that moment of foreign engines and domestic silence, something stirred in her chest. Not anger, not pride, but a need. A need to stop pretending, a need to admit what she had done, or not done. Because some silence becomes a second crime. Across the street, a child began crying. The mother tried to hush him, but he kept looking at the sky and pointing. "Who are they?" Keiko whispered to herself. "They are who we used to be, afraid. of, and now we are afraid to remember who we were. She turned back to her living room and placed the radio on the floor. The volume was still up, but there was nothing but static. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from memory. All the translations, all the lies wrapped in words. She thought of the young American soldier who told her during one interrogation, "If we make it out of this, will you tell the truth?" She had said nothing then, but now she wasn't sure if there was anyone left who wanted the truth, or if the truth still mattered when everyone had already learned to forget. The radio crackled once more, as if trying to speak. She didn't touch it. Because now, Keiko knew, it wasn't about what the radio said. It was about what she was ready to say, for the first time. If this story spoke to something inside you, something buried, something silent, let your voice be heard. Subscribe to our channel, leave a comment with the word truth, and share this video with someone who still believes that silence can protect the past. Because sometimes, the silence is the loudest confession of all. There are memories that do not fade. They calcify. They settle in the bones like cold air on rainy mornings. Keiko's past was not a single moment, but a collection of decisions that seemed small when made, and monstrous in hindsight. Before the silence of Tokyo, before the American engines drew the curtain on the empire, there was a time when she still believed she had control. That belief would break. She was 19 when the first officer came to her family's door. He wore a crisp uniform and offered a respectful bow. Her father, once a proud teacher of literature, had already been reassigned to war propaganda. That was the price of loyalty. They needed translators, girls who spoke English, who could take what the enemy said and turn it into intelligence. Keiko was fluent, quiet, obedient, a perfect fit. The recruitment was not a request. It was wrapped in compliments, but laced with command. Her mother cried that night. Her father only said, "Serve well. We must all do our part." Keiko packed a suitcase the next morning and never returned to that home. The base was not far, but it felt like a different country. The walls were gray and smelled of mold and tobacco. The first room they gave her was windowless. Her job began with intercepting radio transmissions, then quickly evolved. Soon, she was placed in direct contact with prisoners, allied pilots, captured spies, suspected traitors. Her headset became a shield. If she only translated, she was not part of the cruelty. That is what she told herself. One evening, she was brought into a brightly lit room where a young American soldier sat with his hands tied behind his back, blood at the corner of his mouth. His name was Michael. He was barely older than she was. When she began to speak in English, his face changed. Not relief, not fear, just exhaustion. He said one sentence she never forgot. "You look like someone who doesn't belong here." Keiko never answered. She translated his confession, word for word, and ignored the sound of the officer's hand striking his face between questions. That night, she didn't sleep, but she translated for Michael 2 more times. On the 3rd day, he vanished. No one mentioned him again. Her role grew. She became known for her calm voice, her accuracy, her discretion. But those were only masks. Inside, she was unraveling. Every new assignment chipped away at the story she told herself, that she was helping her country, that she was doing what was necessary, that she was keeping her family safe, especially Keiko, her younger sister, 16, rebellious, full of poetry and dangerous questions. She had joined a youth movement that quietly opposed the war, not publicly, not violently, just resistance through art and information. And Keiko knew. She had found one of Keiko's drawings, a caricature of a general with the word liar, scribbled in red. She burned it before anyone else saw. That same month, Keiko was handed a list of names to verify for interrogation. Foreign contacts suspected of feeding information to local dissidents. Most were unfamiliar, but 3 names stopped her breath. Takeshi, Emi, and Daiichi, friends from school, her friends, the ones who shared lunch under cherry trees and once swore they would never be tools for the war machine. She hesitated. Could she say the names were incorrect? Misheard? She almost did. But then she remembered the whisper from her superior 2 weeks earlier. "Your sister is being watched. Be careful where your loyalties lie." So Keiko confirmed the names, and 3 days later, the friends disappeared. Officially, they were never arrested. Off the record, everyone knew what that meant. She stopped looking in mirrors after that. The guilt did not come like a storm. It came like rain dripping from a cracked ceiling. Day after day, sentence after sentence. She felt it. Every time a mother sobbed in the waiting area. Every time a prisoner asked, "Will I die?" And she had to find a word that made the answer sound less like a sentence. She became colder, not by choice, but as armor. When she walked through the halls, soldiers nodded with respect. They called her the ghost voice. She never smiled, never cried. Then came the final fracture. Keiko vanished. No warning, no note. Just an empty room and a window left open. Keiko reported the disappearance to her superior, but the way he looked at her said everything he already knew. She was the sister of a traitor now. Her own safety depended on how much silence she could maintain. For weeks, she expected to be questioned, arrested, removed, but nothing happened, except her reassignment to a quieter post, a place where she transcribed, alone, without contact. Her punishment was not official, but it was real. Isolation, and the growing suspicion that her translations had not been used to protect the country, but to protect secrets. Secrets that had swallowed the people she loved. After the surrender, she left the base without ceremony. No one thanked her. No one accused her. She walked through Tokyo like a ghost, carrying a suitcase and a radio that never turned off. It was the only thing that reminded her she had once been someone important. In the years that followed, she tried to live small. She worked at a second-hand bookstore, avoided conversations, changed her name in some documents. Keiko became her middle name, barely used, but the memories stayed, like the sound of Michael's voice asking her why she was there, like the image of Keiko's empty room, like the last time she said the names of her friends out loud and watched their futures vanish into paper. Some people survived the war by running, others by fighting. Keiko survived by becoming invisible, but no matter how silent she became, the war kept talking, in dreams, in smells, in the texture of certain papers, in the static of the radio. It kept reminding her that language can be a weapon, and she had used it well. If this story made you pause, even for a moment, take a second to be part of our journey. Leave your thoughts in the comments with the word memory and help others discover these voices. Subscribe and stay with us as we uncover what silence often hides. The war had ended, but Tokyo did not feel liberated. It felt amputated. The buildings were still standing, but the soul of the city limped in every direction. Keiko walked those streets as if retracing invisible blood trails, not just from the bombings or the battles, but from the conversations she once translated. Words had been her weapon, and now the echoes of those words followed her like footsteps in alleys she never wanted to revisit. Every time she passed a street market, she paused for a second longer than she should, not because of the produce or the noise, but because crowds reminded her of interrogation rooms, bodies in close proximity, breath and tension, eyes that begged for mercy in a language she had once made her profession. The war had carved Tokyo's silence into her skin, and she had learned to live inside it. One morning, she stepped into a coffee shop she had never entered before. The place was warm, its walls lined with books and yellowed photos of soldiers, American soldiers. One of them, framed above the counter, made her freeze. The face was unmistakable. It was Michael, the same boy she had translated for, the same prisoner who had asked her why she was there. His photograph hung among other war mementos, as if he had been part of Tokyo's healing. But for her, he was a scar that had never closed. She asked the barista about the photo. The young man, barely 25, told her with a smile that Michael Burke had been one of the first American soldiers to be stationed peacefully in Japan. He had later become a journalist, a storyteller, a bridge between two countries that once saw each other as monsters. The man behind the counter poured her tea and said with casual pride, "He said words can end wars." That stuck with me. Keiko left without finishing her drink. That night, The rain returned to Tokyo. She sat on the tatami floor of her apartment with her knees pulled to her chest. She stared at the radio, not because it was on, but because it reminded her that stories never really end. They just wait for the right voice to pick them up again. The next morning, a letter arrived. No sender. Just her name on the envelope in clean English handwriting. Inside, a single page. Miss Keiko Nakamura, I believe you were the translator assigned to my father in 1945, Michael Burke. He wrote about you in his final journal before he died. Said you were the only voice in the room that didn't hate him. I am now in Tokyo. I would like to speak to you. Thomas Burke. She read it 3 times before folding it, with hands that could not stop shaking. Her first instinct was to ignore it. Her second was to run. But somewhere in the space between those impulses was something else, something quieter and heavier. The realization that the story she thought was buried had just taken a breath. When she met Thomas, he looked nothing like his father, but he had the same way of looking directly into her, as if trying to translate her silence. They sat across from each other in a public park near Ueno, surrounded by school children playing in the distance. He pulled out a thin folder. Inside were records, photocopies, declassified documents, transcripts from interrogation rooms. One of them had her name on the margin. A red pencil had circled it. She knew the report. She had written that translation herself. The words were sterile, mechanical, efficient. Her voice on paper. Thomas asked her a simple question. Do you think words can be violent? She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the page, remembering how it felt to sit behind a metal desk and pretend she was not human. Pretend she was a function, a bridge between a scream and a command. She could still hear Michael's voice. It wasn't the things he said, it was the way he said them. Slow, like someone trying not to drown. Thomas continued, My father never blamed you. He wrote that you did your job, but he also wrote that you looked like you wanted to disappear. Keiko asked why he had come. What did he want from her? He told her he was working on a story, a podcast, a documentary. He wanted to tell the lesser-known stories of the war, the quiet ones, the ones that had no heroes, only survivors. He wanted her voice, her version. At first, she refused. She told him that some stories are better left in shadows, but he said something that stopped her breath. If your voice stays buried, all that is left is the silence of others. And silence is not neutral. It always sides with the victor. She agreed to meet again. In the following weeks, they spoke often. Keiko revealed fragments, moments, the smell of sweat in Pivion, a closed room, the way a pencil felt too heavy after transcribing a death sentence. She described the night her sister vanished, the weight of names spoken aloud, the fear of mispronouncing a word that could cost a life. Thomas listened, not like a journalist, but like someone trying to put a ghost to rest. Then one day, he arrived with something she wasn't ready for, a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. He had found it while researching U.S. archives. It had been marked "Never Delivered." Inside was a letter from Akiko, dated September 2nd, 1945, the day of the official Japanese surrender. It was a confession and a farewell. Akiko had joined a resistance movement. She had been warned that her name was on a list. She had fled the city before the roundups began. She wrote that she knew Keiko had betrayed friends, and she forgave her, but she could not return. Not yet. Reading that letter reopened every wound. And yet, in those words, Keiko found something she did not expect. Not forgiveness, but truth. Someone else had spoken the silence out loud. If this chapter moved you in any way, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments. Use the word echo to let us know you're still here, listening. Subscribe if you believe that forgotten voices still deserve to be heard. And never underestimate the power of words to haunt or to heal. The letter from Akiko did not smell like the past. It smelled like something that had been preserved too long. The paper was thin, delicate, like skin that had aged in isolation. Keiko held it in her hands for over an hour before she found the courage to read it again. The ink had faded, but the message was still sharp. Her sister had known everything, not just about the arrests, but about Keiko's silence. and somehow she had found the strength to forgive her. The words cut, not because they accused, but because they didn't. "I survived, Keiko. That should be enough for you to begin again." Those final lines became a weight that pressed against Keiko's chest every time she breathed. Begin again. How could she begin anything when she had built her life on a foundation of secrecy? She spent the following days walking without direction through the city. She passed train stations, temples, and parks she hadn't visited in decades. Each place whispered pieces of memory. The station where she last saw Takeshi, the alley where she and Keiko used to race home after school, the gate of the military compound where her voice became a weapon. She began to realize the city hadn't forgotten her. It had simply been waiting. Inside her apartment, she opened the wooden box where she had stored the few remnants of her former life. Among the papers and photographs was a folder she barely remembered hiding. In it were copies of translated orders. Most were routine, but one document stopped her breath. It was a military directive from 1945, a planned evacuation of a school building being used as a civilian shelter. The translation bore her signature. She remembered working on it during the final weeks of the war, distracted and exhausted. She had rushed through the words. The original order was marked urgent. The translated copy was delayed. By the time the message reached the officers on the ground, it was too late. The school had already been bombed. She collapsed onto the floor, clutching the paper as if she could wring the past from it. That building had housed children, families. She had walked past it years ago, never knowing her failure to act had cost those lives. Her mind spiraled with questions that had no answers. Would things have been different if she had spoken sooner? Had her silence been worse than any lie? That night, she did not sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the city, watching its lights flicker like stars drowning in fog. The street below moved with indifference. But inside her, a decision had begun to form, a quiet defiance. If she could not undo the past, maybe she could, at least, stop running from it. She met Thomas again the next morning. This time she brought the folder with her. She placed it between them on the table like an offering. "I was not just a translator," she said. "I was careless. I was afraid. And because of that, people died." Thomas looked at the documents, slowly, respectfully. He said nothing for a long time. Then he reached into his bag and handed her something in return. A small black and white photograph, a group of children in front of a school building. One of them held a sign in Japanese. The date on the photo matched the day of the bombing. This was taken by an American soldier hours before the attack. He sent it to his family. The building behind them no longer exists. Keiko stared at the children's faces, innocent, smiling, oblivious. She tried to imagine their names, what games they played, what dreams they had. She could no longer carry the illusion that she had been a passive participant. Her voice had weight, and it had been heavy enough to crush. She knew then that words could no longer be enough. She needed to act, but she did not yet know how. That same week, she was invited to speak at a local cultural event. It was a small gathering meant to commemorate those who had been displaced during the war. She accepted, though her hands trembled when she received the invitation. It would be her first time speaking publicly about her role. She stood in front of a modest crowd, mostly elders and students. The microphone echoed slightly. Her voice, at first, was brittle. "I have lived many years in silence," she began. "I thought silence would protect me, but silence became a second prison." She told them about the translations, the mistakes, the school, the friends who vanished. She did not ask for forgiveness. She only asked that they remember, that they understand the weight of words spoken in fear. At the end of her speech, a woman in the front row stood up. She was in her 60s, eyes sharp, expression unreadable. "My brother was in that school," she said. "He died that day." Keiko could not speak. She nodded, slowly, unable to lift her gaze. The woman continued, "But my mother survived. She told me later that she never blamed the war. She blamed the silence that came after. Thank you for breaking that silence." It was the closest thing to grace Keiko had ever received. In the days that followed, she was contacted by a local radio producer. He had heard about her speech. and wanted to interview her, not as a criminal, not as a victim, but as someone who had lived through what others chose to forget. Keiko agreed, not because she wanted recognition, but because she could no longer bear the silence. If any part of this story reached into your chest and stayed there for a moment longer than expected, consider adding your voice to ours. Leave a comment with the word "awaken" and help more people discover these untold truths. Subscribe and stand with us in honoring those whose stories were never supposed to be heard. The radio studio was smaller than Keiko had imagined. A single microphone, 2 chairs, and the low hum of equipment filled the space with quiet tension. The walls were padded with old gray foam that muffled every sound except the one that mattered, her voice. A red light flickered on above the booth window, and she inhaled slowly, not out of nervousness, but reverence. This was not a performance. This was an act of excavation. The interviewer, a young man named Satoshi, adjusted his headset and smiled with a quiet gentleness that reminded her of a Keiko. He asked if she was ready. She nodded, and he leaned forward. We are joined today by a woman whose voice once moved between 2 worlds, Miss Keiko Nakamura, interpreter, witness, survivor. Keiko closed her eyes for a second. She was no longer just a witness. She was evidence. The conversation began with soft questions. Where she grew up, what made her study English, who she lost. Then it moved into the deeper terrain. The job, the fear, the silence that followed. She spoke plainly, carefully, but not coldly. I did not join the war with a weapon. I joined with language. I believed I was only translating, but even a whisper can turn into a command. And I carried many commands. She spoke about the school, about the missed translation, about the children, about the photograph Thomas had shown her. And then, as if pulled from the depths of her breath, she said something she had never admitted aloud. There were moments I altered the words, just enough to delay an order, just enough to confuse a superior. I do not know how many lives it saved. I only know I could not always be silent. There was a pause in the room. Even the machines seemed to stop. Thomas was listening live. He was the one who had encouraged her to say it. The truth about the resistance within the translation. The truth about her quiet rebellion. It had taken her decades to understand that subversion does not always roar. Sometimes it hides in misplaced commas, in mistranslations that buy time. After the program aired, Keiko returned home to find an envelope on her doorstep. No name. Inside were 3 folded documents, classified military memos, and a handwritten note in Japanese. Your voice saved lives. These are the names of those who survived because your delay changed the timeline. She read the names. One stood out. Emmy, her childhood friend. The girl who used to braid Akiko's hair on the school roof. The girl she thought had been executed. She was alive and had lived an entire life because a message had been lost for 12 hours. A mistake that was no mistake. Keiko sat down and cried for the first time in years. Not because of guilt, but because something inside her had shifted. It was no longer about confession. It was about clarity. The past was not black and white. It was handwritten in shades of gray. Soon after, an invitation arrived from the Committee for National Historical Reconciliation. They were preparing a public hearing to document lesser-known stories of the war. Not courtroom trials, not punishments, just truth. Keiko was not sure why they wanted her. Perhaps to include a voice no one expected, a voice that had once served power, now asking for remembrance. She accepted. On the day of the hearing, she wore the same faded gray kimono she had used at her father's funeral. Her hair tied simply, no makeup, no mask. The room was not large, but it was full. Survivors, historians, children of the lost, government representatives, and Thomas, sitting quietly in the back, his camera resting on his lap, but his attention fully on her. When she was called forward, she stepped into the light and adjusted the microphone with steady hands. She began not with an apology, but with a description. The room where I worked had no windows, only walls, and the voices that came through those walls never left me. She explained her role, her choices, her errors, and her attempts to resist. In the smallest ways possible, she told them about the folder, the orders, the lives saved, the ones lost. Her voice did not tremble. A former officer, now a respected historian, stood to challenge her. He accused her of betrayal, of dishonor, of undermining the country's cause. She met his gaze and answered without anger. I was taught that honor was obedience, but I learned that honor without conscience is just another form of violence. I will not be praised for what I did, but I will not be silent about what I saw. The room fell into a silence deeper than any courtroom could impose, a silence made of listening. After she stepped down, a young woman approached her. She held a folder of her own. Inside were photographs, letters, a family tree. She introduced herself as the granddaughter of one of the children from the bombed school. My grandmother survived. She always said someone must have warned them too late, but that the warning still saved her. Now, I know that was you. Keiko looked at the girl's face and saw something she had forgotten existed. Legacy, not of guilt, but of truth. Something she could pass on without shame. That evening, Thomas recorded a final audio entry for the documentary. He read from Michael's journal. She had the kindest eyes in the room. I hope she finds peace. If not for herself, then for all of us. Keiko stood by the window, watching the sun set over Tokyo. Not as a woman hiding, but as someone who had begun to exist again. If you believe stories like these matter, if they hold space for the ones history forgets, we invite you to join our community. Share your thoughts below using the word light. Subscribe to help us keep these memories alive and give voice to those who once had none. The tribunal chamber was neither grand nor severe. It was, in many ways, just a room. But the weight of what it contained made it feel like something more. Rows of wooden benches, a simple podium, a single microphone that stood like a witness. Itself. Keiko arrived early. She did not want to be announced. She wanted to watch the room fill slowly, to see the faces, the breath, the anticipation before memory turned into confession. She sat at the edge of the aisle. The audience was a mixture of scholars, survivors, documentarians, and curious young people who had grown up surrounded by monuments but rarely heard the stories behind them. Some carried notepads, others old photographs. One woman held a folded uniform in her lap like it, still had a heartbeat. At precisely 10 o'clock, the session began. A man with thick glasses and a diplomat's poise stood and welcomed everyone to the national hearing on historical reconciliation. He explained that these testimonies were not legal trials. They were offerings, records for the future, attempts at something more difficult than justice, honesty. When Keiko's name was called, there was a murmur in the room, not because she was famous, but because those who knew her story also knew what it cost to tell it. She rose slowly and walked forward with the grace of someone carrying decades of silence in her spine. She did not read from notes. She did not bring documents. She brought memory. She described the rooms without windows, the sound of chains rattling before voices broke, the language of pain translated into obedience. She described how her hands had once trembled over pages that would decide whether a man lived or vanished. Then she told them what no one expected. She admitted that in her final months, she had altered translations, slipped in extra words, delayed crucial orders, changed times. She did not do it to sabotage the military. She did it to give people hours, days, enough time to disappear, to survive. A silence spread over the room that was not uncomfortable. It was reverent. When she paused, an older man stood up. He was dignified, but his face was stiff with years of knowing too much. He was a retired colonel, now an historian who lectured internationally on wartime protocol. He looked at her with the precision of someone who had judged many. He asked a single question. "Did you believe you were above your orders?" Keiko's reply was not angry. It was patient. "No, I believed I was beneath them. I believed the orders were above humanity. So I chose humanity." The colonel sat down. A woman in the second row, her hair white and her hands twisted by time, raised a photograph. It was of her father, a translator like Keiko, but for the other side. He had been killed by his own country for being too honest. She thanked Keiko for surviving and for speaking, because some voices, she said, are buried with the dead unless someone like you carries them. A soft clap began, not loud, not theatrical. Just one person, then another, then a quiet wave of recognition filled the room. It was not applause for heroism, it was gratitude for the truth. After the hearing, Keiko stepped outside into the early spring air. The cherry blossoms had begun to fall. The petals drifted around her like fragments of forgotten letters. Thomas joined her. He carried a small camera, but he did not film. He only sat beside her and pulled something from his coat pocket. It was a cassette tape. He had found it in his father's belongings. On the label was a date from 1945 and one word written in blue ink, voice. He said it was the only recording his father had kept from his time in Japan. He had never played it. Keiko held the tape like something sacred, not because it was about her, but because it contained something that had waited this long to be heard. Later that night, in the quiet of her apartment, she played the tape. It began with static, then a cough, then Michael's voice. He spoke slowly, with exhaustion and grace. He recounted the moments of his capture, the interrogations, the fear, but then he spoke about her. He did not know her name, only her voice. He said it was the one sound in the room that did not want him to break. He said he hoped she found peace, that she had a life, that she had someone to say her name with kindness. Keiko sat still for a long time after the tape ended. The radio across the room hissed quietly. She turned it off. She no longer needed static to fill the silence. In the weeks that followed, her story appeared in local newspapers, radio programs, and community forums. Not as a scandal, not as a headline, but as a story people needed. A reminder that war is not always about those who fight. Sometimes it is about those who translate its meaning, who decide, word by word, what survives. People began sending letters. Some were from former soldiers, others from children of the war. One letter was from Emmy, her childhood friend, alive, living in a village far from the city. She had heard the broadcast. She forgave her. The letter ended with a simple line, "You were my friend then. You are my friend now." Keiko read the line aloud to herself again and again. In the end, her story was not about betrayal. It was about responsibility. She had not come forward to be seen. She had come forward so others could see what silence had once buried. If this chapter touched something inside you, leave a message below using the word "listen." Each voice shared helps remind the world that memory is not history unless someone is brave enough to speak. Subscribe if you believe stories like this deserve a place in our present, not just our past. 6 months had passed since Keiko last stood in front of an audience. The world outside had not dramatically changed. Trains still passed at dawn. Shopkeepers still raised their metal doors. Students still hurried through narrow streets with bags full of books and unanswered questions. But inside her, everything had shifted with a quiet permanence that no speech or document could undo. She now lived just outside Kyoto, in a small wooden house, surrounded by wind and flowering trees. The city felt softer there, less burdened by concrete and memory. It was not an escape, it was a pause, the kind that lets a damaged heart breathe without apology. Each morning, she swept fallen petals from her front steps. The act was simple, almost meaningless to a passerby, but to her, it felt like prayer. Every petal was a name she could not remember. Every broomstroke was a word she had finally chosen to say. On her small table by the window rested a worn notebook. Inside, she no longer recorded secrets or regrets. She wrote names of people who had reached out to her through letters and messages after her story became known, children and grandchildren of victims, grandsons of prisoners, great-granddaughters of men who had never returned. They did not blame her. They asked questions. They wanted to understand. And in answering them, Keiko realized something no one had ever taught her before. Truth does not always heal everything, but it gives pain a shape, and shaped pain can be carried. One afternoon, a familiar envelope arrived in the mail. The postmark was faded, as if it had traveled a long way to find the right door. Inside was a photograph. An older woman stood beside a simple garden. Her hair was silver, her expression steady. Beneath the image, a name written by hand, Keiko, the sister she never thought she would see again. She had survived. She had grown old. She had built a life in a small coastal town far from Tokyo. She had children, grandchildren. She had chosen silence for years, not because she hated Keiko, but because she needed time to understand her own wounds. The letter that followed was calm, measured, full of words that did not rush. I heard your voice on the radio. It took me back to the girl who held my hand in the dark when bombs fell. I do not blame you for the choices you made. I recognize myself in them. We were both trying to live, and in the end, you chose to stop hiding. That is something I never found the courage to do. At the bottom of the page was a simple invitation. Come see me. The journey by train felt longer than it truly was. With each station passed, Keiko felt younger and older at the same time, as if years were folding in on themselves, waiting to settle in one final moment. When she arrived, Keiko was standing at the platform. No uniform, no bitterness, just a small woman holding a paper umbrella, smiling through tears she did not try to hide. They did not rush to speak. They did not need to. Their embrace carried every sentence, never said. In the days that followed, they walked along the sea. They shared stories that had never made it into letters. They spoke of the night Keiko fled, of the resistance group, of the fear, of the lives that had intersected briefly before history tore them apart. Keiko confessed she had once hated Keiko. Then she admitted that hatred had turned into grief, and finally, into understanding. We were all trapped in a story written by others, she said. You simply found the courage to tell your own. Keiko returned to Kyoto with a heart that was no longer fragmented. The pieces were still there, some jagged, some worn, but they belonged to one whole woman again. Soon after, a local school invited her to speak to students. She stood before children the age she had been when the war swallowed her youth. This time, she did not talk about strategy or politics. She spoke about responsibility, about the power of words, about the danger of obedience without thought. A boy in the back row raised his hand and asked what she would say to her younger self if she could go back. Keiko paused. Then she said, I would tell her that fear is not a country, and silence is not loyalty. The room did not applaud. It listened. That night, she recorded a final message for the radio program that had given her the courage to speak. In a steady voice, she said, I am not a hero. I am just someone who finally chose to remember out loud. Her voice no longer belonged only to the past. It had stepped fully into the present. If this part of her journey reached you in any way, write the word heal in the comments as a quiet promise to yourself or to someone you lost. Subscribe to stay connected with stories that deserve to be carried forward, not buried behind forgotten years. A year had passed. It was not marked by fireworks or grand events. There was no celebration, no ceremony, just time, unfolding like it always does, one morning after another, one cup of tea after the next, until even the loudest memories softened into something bearable. Keiko now lived her life quietly, but not in hiding. There was a difference. She no longer avoided her reflection in the mirror. She no longer recoiled at the sound of English. And when the radio buzzed with static, she listened. Not for codes or commands, just for the comfort of familiar noise. Now, harmless. Her days followed a gentle rhythm. She tended her small garden. She taught English to a group of elderly women who had never learned it in their youth, afraid of what it represented during wartime. Now they laughed over mispronounced words and shared tea after class. They called her sensei, and she allowed it. Her sister, Keiko, visited once a month. They often sat in silence, each with a book, the wind slipping between paper pages. Their connection no longer needed explanation. It simply was. Forgiveness had not come all at once. It arrived in quiet gestures, a shared scarf, a bowl of miso, a hand held during a walk. One afternoon, Keiko received a small package. In the mail, Inside was a handmade journal. On the first page was a message from Thomas, for the names, the faces, and the words you gave back to the world. She used the journal to write letters, not to people she could mail them to, but to those she had never had the chance to speak to. Michael, Takeshi, Emmy, the children in the school, her former self. She did not write to explain. She wrote to acknowledge. Some letters she tore up after writing. Others she folded carefully and placed inside a small wooden box. It was not a ritual of guilt. It was one of memory. The documentary Thomas had produced was released online. It was titled The Voice Between Silence. It received modest attention at first, mostly shared by academic circles and war history enthusiasts. But over time, something unexpected happened. People began sharing their own stories in the comments, not about battles or victories, but about mothers who had never spoken of the war, grandfathers who used to stare out the window for hours, old letters found in attics, school teachers who once translated documents and never spoke of it again. The video became more than a film. It became a space. Keiko watched it once, only once. She heard her own voice woven between interviews, photos, and restored audio recordings. She wept silently when the final credits rolled, not from sadness, but from recognition. For the first time, her life was not just a story she carried alone. It had entered the world. Her final public appearance took place in a university lecture hall. She sat beside historians, archivists, and two other women who had served in administrative roles during the war. The discussion was not about absolution. It was about consequence, the echoes of silence, the burden of having survived when others had not. A student stood up during the Q&A. She was young, nervous. She asked Keiko what she believed people today should remember most. Keiko thought carefully, then said, "Do not wait for permission to speak. The truth will never be convenient, but silence does not protect the past. It only postpones its reckoning." That sentence was later printed on posters across campus. Some kept it in their notebooks. One teacher even painted it on a wall. On her final train ride home, Keiko looked out at the passing trees, their leaves just beginning to fall. She thought of the girl she had been, afraid, loyal, lost, and the woman she had become, still flawed, still quiet, but finally whole. She returned to her little house, made herself a bowl of rice and grilled fish, and opened the window. The wind carried the scent of earth and memory. She whispered goodnight to no one in particular, and smiled. To everyone who has walked through this story, thank you for listening, for feeling, for remembering. If Keiko's journey moved something within you, we invite you to honor it by sharing this video with someone you love. Leave a comment with the word dignity so we know you were here. And if you believe these stories matter, the forgotten, the complicated, the quietly courageous, click to subscribe and join this community. And now, as Keiko would say, with peace in her voice and truth in her heart, go gently. The next story is already waiting for you on the screen. Just press play.